Once again, this week, in the Gospel of Luke, we have the Sabbath. And if it's the Sabbath, we know that Jesus is up to something. This chapter actually starts out with another opportunity for Jesus to heal somebody. It's in those verses we didn't read. I imagine they were left out of the lectionary reading for the week because we already dealt with the healing just, I think, last week. But I just wanted to mention it because he did heal somebody again, so he kind of was calling out the Pharisees again. And the person that he healed this time was a guy with a dropsy. Now, when I was a kid, a long time ago, my mom and my grandparents would refer to the dropsy. They'd say, oh, great uncle so-and-so has the dropsy, and I had no idea what it was. It sounded like something the Packers receiving corps suffered from during the 70s. And then I found out later that dropsy was actually the old term for edema. So it was a serious health condition. And appropriately enough, as we know, Jesus healed the man. Even though it was the Sabbath, because we learned on the Sabbath, if somebody falls into a well, whether it's Timmy or Lassie, pull them out. And that's the right thing to do. And as I said, the healing this week wasn't the focus of the passage. The passage this week dealt with something that was also kind of near and dear to my heart, especially as the school year is getting underway. Because he talks about seating charts, seating arrangements. Now, when I was growing up, again, a very long time ago, seating charts were an important part of that first day of school because that's when the teacher would be sorting everybody out. And those charts would determine who we sat next to for the next eternity. Would we get to sit by our friend? Would we get to sit by somebody who maybe could help us with our work, whether they wanted to or not? Going to a school where there was just one class in each grade moving up, if the teachers were unoriginal and went by alphabet, you always knew who you'd be sitting in back of and who you'd be sitting in front of. For like 3 or 4 grades, I sat behind Joan Halverson. Somebody different behind me each time. I'm not sure what that meant. And the seating also determined what you could get away with. Because if you had a good spot in the back of the classroom, you could sit there and doodle all day and the teacher might never spot you. And if you had a bad spot right up front, well, then your chances weren't so good. I know, I had a bad spell there when my eyes were not good and I didn't have glasses yet, so they moved me up front and I had to actually pay attention. Fortunately, it didn't last long. And then after school, we graduate, we go on, and you get to work. And sometimes, depending on the job you have, there's assigned seating there too. Because you may have your desk, or you may have your cubicle. You may have an office, and those are all status things. Oh, I've got a place with a window. Somebody else says, okay, I've got a place with a door. When I was at UL, we even tended at lunchtime to sit at the same tables in the cafeteria. You'd go up to lunch and you sat here. Everybody knew that. And when somebody was there, that threw you off. And that also applies to church. Because churches have these unwritten seating charts. And I say this in all Christian love because I went to church, of course, many years and I participated in this. I have seen people in the pews be very territorial when it comes to their usual spot. In some churches, standing up here, looking out, you know exactly who's going to be sitting where. And if they're not there, it can throw you off. I had a parishioner at another church who's a dairy farmer for many years. And he insisted that sitting and watching people come into church and going to their pews was like watching the cows coming in and going to their stalls and going to the milking stations. And heaven forbid somebody come in, a new person, and sit in somebody's spot. Because yes, we all want new people to come. We welcome new people, but we don't welcome them in our spots. I know people who got seriously annoyed to find a stranger sitting in their pew. Annoyed to the point where they would, let it ruin their day at church, at least. Stand up here and you look out, maybe scowling, throwing dirty looks at them like, they knew what they were talking about. And then if it happens 2 weeks in a row, it's like West Side Story watching the Sharks and the Jets go at it. People are very attached to where they think they should be. People are attached to their social positions. And back in the time of Jesus, the social position had a lot to do with where you sat. That's what Jesus was talking about when he was lecturing the Pharisees in today's gospel. On the one hand, what he was telling them is just good practical advice how to conduct yourself when you're invited to a party. But it was also another shot across the bow of the Pharisees who, remember, the Pharisees were these ultra-religious, ultra-observant folks who, if you look up the phrase holier than thou in the dictionary, there'd be a Pharisee there. And they lived their lives like they were at the top of the pecking order in Israel, and they were pretty darn sure that when it came to God, God would see it the same way. For all those folks, Jesus had a simple message that day. Guys, try some humility. Try some flexibility. And the context that he used, the metaphor, the Gospel calls it a parable. I'm not exactly sure parable fits, but it's more of a metaphor. Let's talk about seating arrangements at a banquet. Anybody who's ever had to figure out who sits at what table for a wedding reception might understand this. Because I know a little bit about it. I didn't have much to do with it, but I know a little. And I know that when you're doing this, you're trying to figure out, okay, who should sit where, who hasn't seen each other for a while, so you want to group them at the table. Who gets along with who, you don't want to group them at the table unless you're feeling mean, and then you kind of mix it up a little. Who sits at the table with crazy Aunt Mabel? Who can keep her under control? And all of these things, there are all these moving parts that have to be worked out. And that part of what Jesus was talking about, except he was talking about it from the guest's point of view. Now, to appreciate this, you have to know a little bit about how banquets were done in those days. It was not quite like it is today, with all these individual tables. There would typically be one long table. It might be U-shaped. And you didn't sit at the table. You reclined. This was how civilized people ate in that time. You would go, there'd be a little low thing, you'd sit on it, and you would recline. You'd lay like this, you'd eat with your right hand, because you had to eat with your right hand. And you'd eat. And the host, the guest of honor, would in the middle, or recline in the middle. And then the next most important person would sit to that person's right, so they could converse fairly easily. And it went like that all the way down, from the most most important, the least important at the end. Being at the far end was being in social Siberia. It was like getting sent to left field. In a big, noisy gathering, you can imagine that this pretty well eliminated you from conversation with anybody important. And it told everybody, well, so-and-so is not too important because they're down at the end of the table. Nobody wanted to sit there. Except Jesus, as he so often did, just turned everything on its head and said, seek those places out. When you go to a banquet, don't try to sit next to the host because you think that's your rightful spot, because you think you're so important that that's where you should be. Instead, pick a spot way down at the end, away from the host. Pick a spot where, what the host says has to be relayed down to you, like a game of telephone. And the trick to that is if you start low, then you can be elevated. Because if you start high, and then you get reduced because the host comes along and says, I'm sorry, you don't belong here. You're not nearly as important as this person, so you're going to need to move. It kind of stinks. It's like Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving at my house growing up. We had the kids' table and we had the adults' table. If you thought it was time to sit at the adult table and you went there and there weren't enough adult spots, you got sent back to the kids' table and you kind of slumped back. Early walk of shame. It's not even just about the embarrassment that you feel, because what Jesus was doing when he gave this advice, when he told this parable, he used this metaphor, what Jesus was doing was he was encouraging his followers to embrace humility. Not just accept it. Not just to say, okay, I'm down at this end. But to seek it out. Because Jesus said it's not about putting on a show of humility, but it's about leading a life of humility. It's about being humble. Actually being that person that says, I'm not that important, I'll go down here. And in conjunction with that, he had words for the hosts as well, because he told them, don't invite the well-to-do. Don't invite the influential and the powerful. He even said, don't invite your own family members, which could cause some friction. He said, don't invite those people because they can probably repay you. They can invite you to their parties. They can return the favor. Instead, extend that invitation to the poor. Extend that invitation to the needy and the lost and the least, because they've got nothing to offer you in return for your kindness. That's who you should be seeking out. And that's just it's just what Jesus does for us. Because isn't that really a description of the way that God's grace has worked in each of our lives to bring us to that feast at God's table? Regardless of our status, regardless of what we can offer, because we don't have anything that we can offer God to make it worth His while to save us. That happens out of love. Because by dying on the cross and dying for us before we ever said yes to Him, Jesus at that point just threw open the doors to the kingdom of heaven and said, come on in. You're invited. I don't care who you are. I died for you. You're invited. I don't care what you've done. I don't care how rich or poor you are or where you live. I died for you. So come and join me. Jesus promises us that if we reach out to him, he'll take our hand. He'll raise us up to a new life in him. Take us back to that whole Sabbath healing thing. Jesus says if we fall into a well of sin, he'll pull us out. And he'll do it now. So I think about this advice that Jesus gave about how to seat yourself, what seat to take, how to be humble. And I think I would even take it a step further, because when it comes to the kingdom of God, when it comes to knowing Jesus, I don't think it matters where you sit at the table. Because it's enough just to know that there's a seat for everyone that wants one. Amen.